Join us by the fireside for our evening tales of true life's strange experiences with things that lie beyond the veil of the known and into the misty depths of the mysterious and unknown. The terrible growl from inside the school. My mom's side of the family owns a large amount of property in East Texas. It's not hundreds of acres and fields or anything, but it's enough that a few family members live on it and everyone's got enough space. I lived there when I was in 4th grade. Right next to our property, literally touching it, is a small church and graveyard. Then, opposite of our property, at the edge of the church, is more of our property. We basically kind of surround it. This is because my family, having lived in Texas, my ancestors used to own slaves. After the slaves were freed, my great-great-great-grandmother then donated the land to her former slaves so that they'd have a school and a church and could get on with their own lives. The school building is really no longer used, but descendants of these slaves still attend the church every third Wednesday. The school building was cluttered and had been locked with a lost key for about 40 years. Also, about the graveyard, almost half of the graves have my first name somewhere on them, which is, I know it sounds weird, but the name ran in the family and it was kind of passed on to the free slaves. And the church community buries everybody from the church there. So you can imagine how terrifying that graveyard was to little me when I saw my name everywhere. Anyways, school building. A friend and I, when we were little, thought that it would be, kind of a spooky thing to explore. So one night we walked across the property onto the church property, past the church and to the small abandoned school building. The windows were kind of dirty and dusty, and I really distinctly remember that all I could see through the window were just, stacked chairs and desks. And it was all kind of rotting and deteriorated inside, this old furniture. Anyway, we just wanted to get in, just to explore. So imagine the cool old things we'd find in there, But the door was locked. So being 4th graders, we first tried throwing rocks through the window. So unfortunately, this didn't really work very well, and we just kind of gave up after a rock bounced off the window frame and hit my friend in the face. So next, we tried something more daring. We threw rocks at the lock on the door. We gave that up also pretty quickly too because, it wasn't really working very well. So there was just one more thing we decided we wanted to try. We would blow up the front door. After all, we had to see what was inside this old spooky school, right? So we went back across the property into my grandfather's warehouse where he keeps all of this stuff. It's basically a giant tin barn. And, it's just full of stuff in there. And we found all the fireworks. I had never lit fireworks before, so I let my friend do it. So he just kind of picked up a truckload of firecrackers, and we got some old matchbooks, and we went back across the property to the schoolhouse again. Up until this point, the scariest thing that had happened was the fact that we were roaming around in the woods, which were kind of pine forests that surrounded the whole area. And there was nobody there except our chubby little selves. Yes, we were, kind of fat. So as dark as it was, the trees were swaying, the bushes were rustling around, and we could hear the coyotes howling. But we decided to go ahead with Operation Cannot Possibly Fail. I still don't know how fireworks work, but I feel like it's a miracle we didn't start a fire that night. So Daniel slipped a strand of the firecrackers down both of the handles, wrapped one along the hinges, and laid the rest around the lock and handles. Then he just lit them, and we ran far back to watch. And the whole thing just blew up, and it was the loudest, brightest thing I'd ever seen in my life. We watched those firecrackers go off and off and off, and then the lights just stopped. But there was still banging. The banging was different, though. It was kind of rougher. It wasn't a pop anymore of the fireworks. This was different. The firecrackers had actually stopped at that point, and, they just hadn't worked. The door was still very much shut, but it was shaking. It was loudly shuddering and creaking like it was trying to open, as if someone was slamming against it from the other side. Daniel and I took a while to see and understand, especially after disorientation from the fireworks and us being, kind of a little bit asthmatic, what exactly was going on. But the door was definitely shaking loudly, and something was distinctly banging against it from the inside. Just as we both realized this and we grabbed each other for support, whatever was slamming against the door made a noise that I will never forget. Now, I've heard bears and coyotes and hogs and wolves and mountain lions and, weird bird calls and things that shouldn't be in our area, and pretty much any other kind of animal you can imagine. I had never heard this Satan spawn noise before. The best way to describe it is like it sounded like it was, I don't know, some kind of gigantic bear in great pain or something, but it had another kind of element to it that I can't even explain. It was unnatural. It was not like a known animal. There was something almost human-like about it too. Anyway, this noise was loud as hell, and it was accompanied by the banging and rattling and shaking of the door. My friend and I just screamed, and we sprinted away when we heard this, and we were crying from sheer terror of the noise and the shaking door, because there was no denying what was happening, and this was not something natural. This was not something that could be mistaken. There was something behind that door, and it was not human, and it was not a known animal. We just sprinted all the way back to my grandparents' house with only like 3 inhaler breaks. My grandparents were asleep, but my mom was down there and had actually been looking for us. My friend and I were kind of pudgy, and we were just in tears, and when we got there. And we were not speaking comprehensibly enough, and after 30 minutes, we did end up being able to tell Mom that there was something in the schoolhouse at the church. She kind of disregarded us, and she scolded us for leaving, and she didn't even want to listen to us. But nevertheless, my grandfather asked permission of the church owners before we properly broke the door lock with a pair of those giant plier things. My uncle was standing ready with a shotgun in case it was a bear or something. There was nothing in there but cobwebs. To this day, and Daniel and I are still very close friends, no one will believe us about what happened that night, but we will never forget that noise of that thing inside there. And, I have no way to prove to anyone that it was paranormal, but I sure as hell know that it was. Wow, well, if you actually went in there and, nothing came out, there was no animal or anything in there that you could see, then definitely could be something paranormal. Unless there had been somebody in there somehow and they got out. They had I don't know, they just left when you weren't looking, when there was nobody around or something. But, it doesn't quite sound like it. It sounds like, it just doesn't sound like the kind of place where someone would want to just hang out and, not even a homeless person. Not quite the right location for that kind of thing. And also that sound you heard doesn't sound like something that a person would have made. So definitely sounds like something unexplained, and something nasty that you were lucky you got out of there and you didn't actually encounter it and it wasn't able to open the door. The sweet old couple. When I was a kid, down the road from us, there lived this old couple. They were just so kind and loving, and they were friendly, and they were just, some of the most awesome people on the planet. I considered them like a set of second grandparents. Well, one day, I believe it was around 2004 or close to that, I was up late and I was just messing around on the internet, and it was just after midnight, and I smelled something weird. My room started to smell like cocoa butter lotion. It was like, WTF? I sniffed around for the source and found nothing. I brought my mom up and she sniffed around and she acknowledged that yes, she could smell it. It was cocoa butter. So I shrugged and I went back to my gaming. But the smell lingered for about 4 hours before finally disappearing. I didn't really think that much of it until the next day. The elderly woman of the couple that I mentioned died in her sleep that same night, shortly after midnight. And I did not happen to mention before that she loved cocoa butter lotion. Because she loved cocoa butter lotion, yeah, I think I was visited by her ghost. Well, that didn't end there because the smell returned the next night too. So this time I knew what it was. So I started speaking to her and I said my goodbyes and I thanked her for being around, etc. And after a couple of hours I went to bed and the smell was still there and it was really starting to freak me out this time. Eventually, in my fear, I kind of snapped and I told her to stop and go away, please, because she was scaring me. Within a couple of minutes, the smell just vanished. I cried because it suddenly hit me that she was gone and she came to see me and I yelled at her, so I felt really bad. But it didn't end there. A few years later, my uncle, who I later found out was my real father who didn't want me, was dying of cancer, throat cancer, I think, and was in the hospital. Then, one day, shortly after he was admitted, I, randomly, smelled the cocoa butter lotion again at about 4 p.m. But it only stayed for about 2 minutes and then disappeared. But I knew what it was. Half hour later, they called us and told us that he died at 4 p.m. 1 week later, the night before the funeral, it was late at night and I was trying to sleep and the smell came back again. So I said out loud that I would see him again in the morning, and the smell almost instantly disappeared. Not sure if it's related, but the next day my grandmother was admitted to the hospital with a possible heart attack. Fortunately, it wasn't. It actually turned out to be, bad heartburn. That was a fun thing to get a call for right after a funeral, though. After a year later, the elderly man who was the husband of the first, old lady, died in his sleep, and I smelled this again that same night. It didn't stay long, though, and I was confused as to who it might be. But then I got the call the next day that he had passed away. He was a rather sad case after his wife passed, and it literally just not only broke his heart, but it broke his mind. And he was fine before it, but when she passed, he just got full-blown Alzheimer's. So it was actually a good thing that he passed away, not too long after, and joined her. So anyway, I, for some reason, can smell people who are close to me when they die. They smell like cocoa butter lotion. So the effect of that now, however, is that whenever I smell cocoa butter lotion, I get scared. I get terrified sometimes. Well, getting like a phantom smell, that really is kind of a giveaway as to, you know, who is there. Because, it's like someone who used to smoke, or especially if they smoke cigars or something like that, quite often that smell would suddenly appear in a room or a place where they used to smoke or something, or a lady who wore perfume or something, and then you'd get that whiff of perfume in an old house or something. There seems to be quite an ongoing theme in quite popular in hauntings, that you do get smells as well, like smells of death, as someone's perhaps died of disease or something like that, lingering in an old house or something. Um, so one kind of wonders, how many times have we just, randomly smelled something that was like a scent that just suddenly appeared for no apparent reason, and not really thought about the fact that maybe, just maybe, it was just a passing spirit, you know? It's interesting to think about that, isn't it? The old 18th century hall. When I was in the fourth year of school, I was about 13, 14 years old, and I don't know what this translates to in American schools because this was a British school. I went to a private convent school. Anyway, one of the girls there was really nice, and I was invited to her house for an overnight stay. She lived in this big 18th century hall, which is a very large house, in the northeast of England, miles away from anywhere. And they had land, it was like an estate. She had ponies, and I was really excited at the thought of staying over and just riding out. I didn't know at the time that her mom and dad were divorcing, and he was this nasty alcoholic piece of work. My friend had an older sister who had been in trouble at school and was generally just kind of having a hard time, smoking, fighting, and just getting into trouble. And the house had a real life poltergeist, which of course nobody told me about before I turned up. And I suppose I wouldn't have known what it was then anyway. So my mom and my granny took me in the car. We drove up to the front of the house and we sat there a moment, admiring the place. I always remember this, as we all heard something with big claws scratch down the side of the car. It sounded so weird and terrifying, but honestly, it's what we heard. And it was just right out there. Everyone was like, "Oh my God." We looked out of the car window expecting to see an animal or something, but there was nothing there. And there was nothing under the car. When we got out, I did not want to get out, by the way. There were no scratches at all, which would have been impossible because from the sounds and how loud it was when we were in the car, I mean, there definitely was something scratching the car to pieces. So I have no idea what it could have been, but we didn't see any animal, and there was nowhere that anything could have ran off into the bushes anyway, because there were no bushes right there where the car was parked. So I asked Mom a while later what she thought that it was, and she just kind of weakly answered, "A badger?" But a badger wouldn't have gone up and scratched a car. Surely, that would have been ridiculous. There were no dogs outside, and the dogs, well, were shut up in the puppy cages in the kitchen because they were still quite young. The house did not have a nice feeling. It was pretty and very artistic, and it was made of a lovely grey stone with these stone hounds on the gateposts. But when you walked in, it just felt heavy and ominous, it was like it was alive or something, like you were being watched. It had eyes. As a teenager, I was aware that the atmosphere was kind of very flat too, but didn't really think about it at the time. So anyway, we had dinner, we went to see the horses, etc., and we just generally kind of messed around for a while. They had interconnecting doors with little spaces inside, I'm not sure if you know what that is, but anyway. It was like when you would open one door and step up a step, and then straight away open the next door. The space inside wasn't much more than a foot. Well, I opened the first door and I went inside, and then I couldn't open the door in front of me or the door behind me. It was like I was stuck. After a bit of frantically shaking the door and giving it a good kick, it finally flew open and I just shot out into the next room. Apparently, it had never stuck before, and everyone crowded round to see what on earth was happening. Later on that day, we were in the garden when someone started throwing pebbles at us. Now, thinking that it was the older sister, we shouted for them to stop, but the pebbles just kept going. They never hit us, they just sort of plopped around us in the front lawn, which in itself was kind of odd because I would have thought that something would have hit us. It looked as if they were being thrown from an upstairs window, too, but I couldn't see anyone doing it when I looked up. And yes, when we went inside to complain, the sister was not upstairs. She was in the kitchen with her mom and had been the whole time. So there was nobody actually upstairs. I suppose she could have dashed around from the front to the back, but, it's just not likely. And she didn't have the look on her face that told us that, that she'd been up to anything either. It was like she was just doing some stuff in the kitchen and she just looked normal. The house itself was really cold too, although, most houses were back then. And they couldn't keep their goldfish alive either because it was just too cold. The dogs wouldn't go into the front room, and all in all, it just wasn't a very nice place to sleep or stay in, really. It just didn't feel comfortable or something. My friend said that she used to see phantom dogs on the front lawn running around, and she often heard footsteps in the attic. Anyway, I had a nice weekend. I went out for a ride, did a bit of shopping with my friend, and then went home again. In lower sixth, my friend dropped out of school. She was really bright, and I lost touch. So I never went back to the house, but I often wonder whether the strange things was still happening or whether they stopped when the family moved out. I don't know, but either way, I'm pretty sure that place is haunted. Well, I've heard that poltergeists do often seem to be attracted to or maybe happen as a result of troubled teenager or, kind of just negative energy, sometimes associated with drug dealing or, alcoholism or something like that, or just kind of emotional traumas or just stuff like that. And for some reason, they do seem to quite often be somehow connected to young people, to a teenager in particular, that may happen to be in the household. So it's hard to say whether poltergeists are really just entities of themselves or whether there's some kind of manifestation of the turbulent energies of one particular person, or perhaps more than one, in a given home family unit. Perhaps it's both. I don't know, but certainly a fascinating story. An urban legend. Perhaps the scariest thing that has happened to me involves an urban legend in my hometown. And it's happened around, I don't know, maybe 6 years ago or so. So, to explain the story, it's about a woman who hung herself from a particular kind of tree. I don't remember what kind. After being raped by Japanese fishermen after discovering that she was pregnant. Thus, she was called after this tree. Anyway, she's said to be situated around the army base that we have here. So late one night, my eldest sister, brother, and their partners decided to go to the army tunnels, break in, and just kind of hang out there. They didn't stay for very long because once they were in, They said that they had heard footsteps and they just ran out and left thinking that it was a security guard. They arrived home around 11 p.m. and they went to sleep. My mother, little brother, and I were still awake, however. Mom was drunk, playing the piano loud from the TV. I was on the family computer in the lounge room, and my brother was getting ready to go to bed. Suddenly, he had ran out into the lounge room and he was screaming. Can you hear that? Of course, we couldn't hear what he was referring to, so he muted the television, and we were up against the window with our ears pressed against it, trying to listen for whatever it was that we were supposed to hear. There was a light moan coming from outside the window, and it sort of sounded feminine. It wasn't just outside the window we were at. It seemed to be circling around the house, and we could hear it coming from the window opposite to the one that we were at, and then the door on the side. It seemed to be growing louder and louder and louder, and the wind literally picked up and was hurtling around with this sound. It got so loud and dramatic that my brother and I were on the ground with our ears covered, crying and screaming, because we knew that this was not something normal. We have spoken about this after the incident, and we both recall being able to hear the sound at the exact same volume, even with our ears covered. It's almost as if it was in our heads, too. We couldn't block it out. This went on for about 5 to 10 minutes, and it was like torture. Eventually, it suddenly just stopped, and it was silent, and there was no wind outside. Mom was there with us, and she recalls nothing happening. She didn't hear a thing. It was only after we moved out of that house years later that when we realized there was a tree of that particular kind, as, in that urban legend, that was right outside of that window. Wow, that reminds me of the, those old stories about the banshees. Banshee was like this screaming kind of ghost of this female entity that would, she was like a harbinger of doom or death or something in the family, like someone was going to die. And she would scream, and you would hear this scream just outside around the house or whatever, the family house. And I think sometimes she would appear as this, hideous kind of hag. I don't know if it was a hag or just a woman just screaming, spirit. And so this kind of reminds me of it almost. But it sounds like it's probably part of that original legend or something. So it's hard to say, but it just kind of reminded me of that and sounds just as terrifying.